NHL Free Agency has been absolutely insane this year. As I'm making this video, we're currently at the end of day 2 of free agency, and a bunch of free agents have been signed. I took the time compiling every single free agency signing and every team that's out there, and I all compiled them into one video, and I'm going to go over them here. This video took a lot of time and effort to find every single free agent that signed this year, so if you could go ahead and drop a like on the video and consider subscribing, I'd really appreciate it. I'm going to start by going through the teams in alphabetical order. So without further ado, let's dive into Anaheim. Anaheim has been the least busiest team this year in free agency, and they just made their first signing today. The Ducks signed Jansen Harkins to a $787,000 annual value contract for 2 years. With that being their only signing, let's move on to Boston. Boston got a couple of the big free agents this year and got Elias Lindholm at $7.75 million for 7 years. They also got Nikita Zadorov for $5 million for 6 years. On top of that, they got Max Jones at $1 million for 2 years, Riley Tuff for $775,000 for 1 year, and Billy Sweezy for $775,000 for 2 years. Moving on, we're going to the Buffalo Sabres. They signed Sam Lafferty to a $2 million annual value contract for 2 years, Jason Zucker for $5 million for 1 year, Nicholas Aube-Kubel for $1.5 million for 1 year, Jacob Bryson for $900K for 1 year, Dennis Gilbert for $825K for 1 year, Jack Rathbone for $775,000 for 1 year, and James Reimer for $1 million for 1 year. Next team up is the Calgary Flames. Calgary signed Anthony Mantha to a $3.5 million contract for 1 year. Yegor Sharangovich extended for $5.75 million for 5 years. Ryan Lomberg then signed a $2 million annual value contract for 2 years. Devin Cooley signed a $775,000 annual value contract for 2 years, and Martin Ferk signed a $775,000 contract for 1 year. The Carolina Hurricanes then extended Jacob Slavin for $6.43 million for 8 years, Eric Robinson for $950,000 for 1 year. They then signed Jordan Martinick for $3.05 million annual value contract for 3 years. They then signed William Carrier to a $2 million annual value for 6 years, Shane Gostisbehere for $3.2 million annual for 3 years, and Sean Walker for $3.6 million annually for 5 years. Next up, we have the Chicago Blackhawks. Their first free agent signing was signing Tyler Bertuzzi to $5.5 million for 4 years. Teuvo Teravainen returns to the team for $5.4 million annually for 3 years. Alex Martinez is joining the team for $4 million for 1 year. Laurent Brossoit is joining for $3.3 million for 2 years. Pat Maroon is joining on $1.3 million for 1 year. Craig Smith is joining on a 1x1 deal. Joey Anderson is signing for $800K for 2 years. TJ Brody signed for $3.75 million for 2 years. Next up, we have the Colorado Avalanche. First up, they signed Jonathan Drouin to a $2.5 million annual contract for 1 year. Jacob McDonald then signed for $775,000 for 2 years, and Eric Brandstrom then signed for $900K for 1 year. The Columbus Blue Jackets signed Sean Monahan to a $5.5 million annual contract for 5 years, and then signed Dylan Gambrell for $775K for 1 year. Next up, the Detroit Red Wings signed William Lagesson for $775,000 for 1 year, Cam Talbot for $2.5 million annually for 2 years, Eric Gustafsson for $2 million annually for 2 years, Sheldon Dray for $775,000 for 2 years, Jack Campbell for $775K for 1 year, and Kristen Fisher for $1.125. The Edmonton Oilers had a couple big free agent signings. First up, they had Connor Brown on $1 million for 1 year, James Hamblin for $775,000 for 2 years, Noah Phillip for $775,000 for 1 year. They then signed Victor Arvidsson for $4 million for 2 years, Josh Brown for $1 million for 3 years, Colin Delia for $775,000 for 1 year, Corey Perry for $1.4 million for 1 year, Jeff Skinner for $3 million for 1 year. They then re-signed Matthias Janmark for $1.45 million for 3 years, Troy Stetcher for $787,000 for 2 years, and Adam Henrique for $3 million for 2 years. Next up, we have the Stanley Cup winning Florida Panthers. First up, they signed Sam Reinhart to an $8.625 million annual value contract for 8 years. Dmitry Kulikov signed for $1.15 million annually for 4 years. AJ Greer signed for $850K for 2 years. Jesper Boquist signed for $775,000 for 1 year. Chris Drieger signed for $775,000 for 1 year, and Mackenzie Antwistle signed for $775,000 for 1 year. Next up, the LA Kings. They signed Joel Edmondson to a $3.8 million contract annually for 4 years, Jeff Malott for $775,000 for 2 years, Phoenix Copley for $825K for 1 year, and Trevor Lewis for $800K for 1 year. Next, we're going up to Minnesota, where they signed Yakov Trenin for $3.5 million annually for 4 years. Next, we're going to go up to Montreal. First, they signed Alex Barre-Buell for $775,000 for 1 year, and their big free agency move was extending Juraj Slafkowski for $7.6 million for 8 years. Now, we're going down to arguably the winners of free agency this year, and that would be the Nashville Predators. They signed Steven Stamkos to $8 million annually for 4 years, Jonathan Marchessault for $5.5 million annually for 5 years, Brady Shea for $7 million annually for 7 years. They then signed Scott Wedgwood to be the backup for $1.5 million annually for 2 years, Alexander Carrier to $3.75 million annually for 3 years, and Matt Murray, not the Toronto one, for $775,000 for 1 year. The New Jersey Devils signed Brett Pesce to a $5.5 million annual contract. They then signed Brandon Dillon to a $4 million contract for 3 years, Mike Hardman to a $775,000 annual contract for 2 years, Thomas Tatar for $1.8 million for 1 year. Next up, we're heading over to Long Island, where they signed Mike Riley for $1.25 million for 1 year, and then they got Anthony Duclair for $3.5 million annually for 4 years. Now we're going to head over to the other part of New York and go to the New York Rangers. First up, they signed Sam Carrick to a $1 million annual contract for 3 years. They then signed Benoit Olivier Gruel to $775,000 for 1 year and Casey Fitzgerald for $775,000 for 2 years. Next up, we're going to head up to Canada's capital and go to Ottawa. First up, the Senators signed David Perron to $4 million annually for 2 years, Noah Gregor for $800K for 1 year, Garrett Poulin for $775,000 for 2 years, Jeremy Davis for $775,000 for 1 year, Philip Roux for $775,000 annually for 2 years, Hayden Hodgkinson for $775,000 for 1 year, Adam Gaudette for $775,000 for 1 year, and Shane Pinto got extended for $3.75 million annually for 2 years. Next up, let's head over to Philadelphia. They signed Eric Johnson to a $1 million contract for 1 year, and Garnet Hathaway got a $2.4 million annually contract for 2 years. Next up, let's head over to the other part of Pennsylvania and go see the Pittsburgh Penguins. First up, they signed Ryan Shea to $775,000 for 1 year. They then signed Anthony Beauvillier to a $1.25 million contract for 1 year. They then signed Jimmy Huntington for $775,000 for 1 year and Nathan Clurman for $775,000 for 1 year. They also signed Emil Benstrom for $775,000 for 1 year. They then signed Blake Lizotte for $1.85 million annually for 2 years. They then signed Sebastian Aho, the one from the New York Islanders, for $775,000 for 2 years. Let's take a deep dive over and go to the West Coast, where the San Jose Sharks signed Tyler Toffoli for $6 million annually for 4 years, and they then signed Alex Wennberg for $5 million annually for 2 years. Next, let's head up the West Coast even farther and go up to Seattle, where they signed Brandon Montour to a $7 million annual contract for 7 years. They also signed Chandler Stevenson for $6.25 million annually for 7 years, which was one of the more perplexing deals of the day. Next up, let's head over to St. Louis, where they signed Kasperi Kapanen to a $1 million contract for 1 year and Corey Schooneman for $775,000 for 1 year. They also extended Pavel Buchnevich for $8 million annually for 6 years. They then signed Pierre-Olivier Joseph for $950,000 for 1 year. Next, we're going to head over to Tampa Bay, who got the other big fish this year in free agency, who is Jake Gensel. They signed him to a $9 million annual contract for 7 years. They then signed Jesse Ylonen for $775,000 for 1 year. They also got Zemzis Girgensons for $850K for 3 years. They extended Victor Hedman for $8 million annually for 4 years. And they then signed Cam Atkinson for $900K for 1 year. Then let's head up to Toronto, where they signed Joseph Woll to a contract extension for $3.66 million annually for 3 years, Chris Tanev for $4.5 million annually for 6 years, Oliver Ekman-Larsson for $3.5 million annually for 4 years. They then got Anthony Stolarz for $2.5 million annually for 2 years, Matt Murray, the one from Pittsburgh, for $875K for 1 year, and Yanni Hakanpää for $1.5 million annually for 2 years. Next, let's head over to Utah for the newest team in the NHL, the Utah Hockey Club. They signed Ian Cole for $3.1 million for 1 year, Kevin Stenlund for $2 million for 2 years. They then signed Kevin Connaughton for $775,000 for 2 years, and Andrew Agozzino for $775,000 for 2 years. Next up, we're going to head up to Vancouver, who signed Jake DeBrusk for $5.5 million annually for 7 years, Kiefer Sherwood for $1.5 million annually for 2 years, Danson Heinen for $2.25 million annually for 2 years. They then signed Derek Forbort for $1.5 million for 1 year, Yuri Patera for $775,000 for 2 years, Craig Smith for $775,000 for 1 year. They then signed Vinny Desharnais for $2 million annually for 2 years. Winding down now, we got Vegas, who signed Zach Aston Reese for $775,000 for 1 year. They then signed Tanner Lazijan for $775,000 for 2 years, Ilya Samsonov for $1.5 million for 1 year, Pavel Doryaev for $1.835 million annually for 2 years. They then signed Victor Olofsson for $1 million for 1 year. Then we're going to head to Winnipeg for the final team, who signed Eric Comrie to $825,000 for 1 year, Capo Kakinen for $1 million for 1 year, and then they signed Jarrett Anderson Dolan for $775,000 for 2 years. But whenever you have free agency, you also have trades that happen. So these are the trades that happened during the free agency period as well. Jacob Chychrun got traded from the Ottawa Senators to the Washington Capitals for Nick Jensen and a 2026 third-round pick. Riley Smith for 25% retention to the New York Rangers for the 2027 second-round pick and a fifth-round pick. The Senators traded Matthew Joseph and a 2025 third-round pick to the Blues for future considerations. The Stars then traded Radek Faska to the Blues for future considerations, and the Seattle Kraken traded Brian Dumoulin to the Anaheim Ducks for a 2026 fourth-rounder. There's a bunch of movement right now in the NHL, and things have never been more crazy. I'm going to keep you updated with everything that happens, so make sure you subscribe to the channel and watch my shorts. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next one.